Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala ma ba'd. Jamaatul Muslimin, respected viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum jami'an, aynama kuntum. Welcome to each and every single one of you, wherever you might be. This is our program, Palestine, the Holy Land. And as we look to the present day situation, the absolutely apocalyptic and dystopian images that are coming out of the Gaza Strip, Qita'u Gaza, Qita'u Izza, that in all of the suffering, in all of this destruction and devastation, in the midst of a genocide and a Holocaust, the people of Gaza are still saying, Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil. That Allah is enough for us. And excellent is He as a protector for us. Still, and the number has now exceeded 800, as starving Palestinians line up for food, starving, line up for a little bit of flour or any other basic elements to perhaps fight the pangs of hunger. But every single day are being killed, are being corralled like cattle and then slaughtered like at an abattoir. Every single day. In fact, the last image that I saw was yesterday, where thousands of Palestinians were literally laying flat on the ground as the machine gun bullets were flying over their heads. I don't know how many were hit on that day. It was a short clip, and very close to them, the bullets were hitting the top of the sand. And it's now over 800. And we're speaking purely about those that have been lining up for food. Innocent civilians, starving civilians, being shot at, being murdered in cold blood. And the world is watching. We wish there was more that they were doing than just watching. For quite some time now, the world has been watching and the world has been talking, but little has the world been doing. There was now a conference in Colombia, the so-called Hague Group, being co-hosted by South Africa and Colombia, with 30 other nations that are saying that now is the time for action. No more talking. No more workshops, no more talk shops. But now is the time for action. For too long now, the Zionist state has been operating with absolute impunity, with the cover of America and their other Western allies and the global South, along with other partners from other places in the world, are saying now, enough is enough. Qwanele, qwanele. Genoeg is genoeg. Kifaya, kifaya. Enough is enough. The situation is dire. According to the Lancet, and this is now over 6 months ago, they estimate that those that have been killed directly or indirectly as a result of the Zionist state's onslaught on the Gaza Strip, they put the number in excess of 200,000. The official number is now sitting at around about 60,000. And that is besides the bodies that are still lying under the rubble that have not been recovered. We're looking at least in the region of 20,000 children. plus minus. Of all the victims of this genocide, of this Holocaust, 70% are women and children. Again, there are fuel shortages now, and there is no fuel to operate the incubators. So many infants, many Palestinian infants in Gaza, unless they get fuel, are expected to die at any time now. Again, I use the word apocalyptic and dystopian. Not even Hollywood could reproduce the likes of the landscape of Gaza. Everywhere you look, not just destruction, but the Gaza Strip has been pulverized. And remember that the Gaza Strip, the biggest open-air prison in the world, the most densely populated area in the world, before October the 7th. The Zionists are now corralling the 2.1 Palestinians into 16% of the Gaza Strip. That's what they are trying to do. A modern-day concentration camp. And if it was already being called an open-air prison, if it was already being called a concentration camp on 100% of the land of the Gaza Strip, what is it going to be like when all the infrastructure is destroyed and the Palestinians are now squeezed onto 16% of the land? There was a Jewish actor. I'm trying to think of his surname. I think his first name is Manny. And he was being interviewed on a program where he appealed, as a Jew, he appealed to Jews all around the world to sit quietly and to ponder and to think that about what happened to them as a people over the centuries, how they were persecuted. Think about their ancestors. And of course, the most notable persecution was in the Holocaust, in the Second World War. He says, after this has been done to you, how can you do it to anybody else? He made an impassioned plea. And as we know, and as we always do on this program, we always remind ourselves that Zionism is not Judaism. That there are many Jews that are opposed to Zionism, opposed to the Zionist state, opposed to what the Zionist state is doing, how they are persecuting the Palestinians in this brutal occupation and have been doing so for the last 77 years. In actual fact, longer than that if we include the treatment of the Palestinians, even from the time of the first Aliyah, which was from 1882, something that I have mentioned a number of times on this program. People like Asher Ginsburg wrote about this. Ahad Aham, or in Arabic, Ahadul Awam, one of the people, that was his nickname. A liberal Jewish Russian thinker and a leading Eastern European Jewish essayist who visited Palestine in 1891 for 3 months. In 1891, Ahad Aham opened many Jewish eyes to the fact that Palestine was not empty, number one, but populated with its indigenous people when he wrote, "We abroad are used to believe that Eretz Israel," remember he's also a Zionist, but he was the father of cultural Zionism. Now you have general Zionism, which was basically general political Zionism, which started by Theodor Herzl. You had revisionist Zionism, that was Ze'ev Jabotinsky. You had liberal democratic Zionism, so-called, that was Chaim Weizmann. You had socialist Zionism, the father of that being Nachman Sirkin, and then that was, of course, taken over by the likes of David Ben-Gurion. And then you also had the likes of religious Zionism, which was started by a very minuscule percentage of Orthodox Jews, so-called Orthodox, but according to the mainstream rabbinical Orthodox Jews, that it went totally against the theology of rabbinical Orthodox Judaism. And the one who came to represent so-called religious Zionism in the Zionist state was the likes of Abraham Isaac Cook, whose son became the leader of the settler movement post the 1967 Six-Day War. And I put that in inverted commas because this is not a conflict, this is not a war. This is a settler colonial project that uses violence, brutal violence, savage violence, in order to subjugate a people and remove them, transfer them, the nice word used by Israel Zangwill. I mean, he was the most consistent of all the Zionist forefathers or early Zionists that promoted the transfer or the ethnic cleansing. Transfer, that I put in inverted commas, which is another word for, a nice word for ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people out of Palestine, which in itself is genocidal. And this kind of rhetoric is being repeated over and over and over again, right up into this very year of 2025. Since that time, what did you say? The Arabs will have no other choice but to trek, using the term that the Afrikaners used when they trekked from the Cape Colony to the Orange Free State and to the Transvaal. He said the Palestinians will have to trek. They will have to leave. And he was of great influence on the thinking of Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the father of revisionist Zionism, who said that the American Jews can pay $500 million and the Palestinians can be then transferred to Iraq and to Saudi Arabia. David Ben-Gurion said the Arabs will have no other choice but to flee. He said, we've come to replace them. And that is why in 1937, when only 20% was offered to the Zionists, 20% of Palestine was offered to the Zionists, he wrote to his son Amos and he said, this is only a stepping stone. And even in 1947 with the partition plan at the United Nations, where they were offered 55%, he again noted that this is only a step towards taking over the entire land, historical land of Palestine. So what we have been speaking about, and I want to take us back from where we left off, we were speaking about the period between 1917 and 1948. It's impossible to understand the plight of the Palestinians without understanding the Palestinian revolt, 1936 to 1939, and then the subsequent Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. It's essential that we do a deep dive in order to understand what the Palestinians have been through, how they have tried everything in order to assert their self-determination, their rightful self-determination in the land of their ancestors, being the indigenous people of historical Palestine. I mean, if we are to do some DNA testing on the Palestinian people, Some estimates put, or they say that, or they estimate that about 80% of Palestinians, that their DNA can be traced back to the early Neolithic farmers, the Natufian farmers from 5,000 years ago. There is Canaanite DNA. There is Philistine DNA. There is Jewish or Israelite DNA in the Palestinians. Original Israelite DNA. From those that settled the land from the time of Joshua and Caleb and the second generation of the Israelites that were taken out of Egypt. And then, of course, plenty of Arab DNA as well. Remember, being Arab has not just to do with one's ethnicity in terms of blood, in terms of lineage, in terms of genealogy. But anybody that speaks Arabic, because Arabic became, especially with the advent of the coming of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then the rapid spread of Islam across North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula, as far east as China, Arabic became the lingua franca. Arabic became the lingua franca of the world, of that part of the world. The North Africa, Mediterranean basin, going up into parts of Anatolia, the Middle East, into Persia, into Mawara al-Nahar, Transoxania, between those two rivers that we spoke about in Central Asia, the Oxus and the Siridaya. And so what happened was that those that then adopted Arabic as their mother tongue automatically became Arabs. Whether they had some connection genealogically with the Arabs of Arabia, whether it was the Arabs of Yemen, Al-Arab al-Ariba, the original Arabs, Al-Qahtaniyun, or whether it was their connection to Al-Arab al-Musta'riba, the Arabized Arabs. Remember, the Arabized Arabs come from Ismail, who married Ramla, the daughter of Madad ibn Amr al-Jurhumi, who came from Yemen. Jurhum, one of the four sons of Qahtan. So the children of Ismail, from where our beloved Prophet ﷺ descends, they are Arabized Arabs. So being Arab doesn't mean that you only belong to one particular race or tribe or clan. In fact, Sheikh Bashir, the famous Sudani Sheikh, gave a beautiful lecture the other day about that being Arab, identifying as Arab, is identifying oneself as a speaker of the Arabic tongue. And so when we speak about the Palestinians as being Arabs, doesn't mean that they all descend from Arabia. No, 80%. According to some geneticists, that 80% of the Palestinians, their DNA is firmly rooted in the land as the original indigenous inhabitants of that land. The Neolithic farmers, the Natufians, the Canaanites, even Israelites, and the Arab tribes that moved up from Arabia. But it was of course, if you look on the map, if you look at the historical land of Palestine, it's in the center of the world. It's in the center of the world, and it is a crossroads of many nations, many empires. And when the empires occupied these places, very often those that were tilling the land, they didn't change. those same peoples that had been tilling the land for hundreds, if not thousands of years, relatively. Of course, you also had nomads that moved in and moved out. So whether it was the Akkadians, or whether it was the Babylonians, or the Assyrians, or the Persians, the Achaemenids, whether it was the Macedonians, the Romans, you have Palestine at the crossroads of where all these empires once upon a time dominated, subjugated, and ruled over the peoples of that land. And so, understanding the plight of the Palestinian people in their realization of self-determination, and again, Palestine as a mere geographical designation, because the land has been called Palestine for the last 2,000 years. So geographically, it is Palestine. The Romans, they named it Syria Palestina. That was in the 2nd century, meaning Syria's Palestine, because Palestine is part of Greater Syria. And no matter what reason for which they named it, some say as an erasure of the presence of Judeans in that land. Why? Because Hadrian, what did he do? After the Bar Kokhba revolt by Simeon Bar Kokhba, 132 to 134, what did he do? He deported the Judeans from the area of Judea, and he renamed it Syria Palestina. And then in the Byzantine era, it was divided into 3 provinces. Palestina Prima, Palestina Secunda. So Palestina Prima basically included the old Roman designated areas of Judea and Samaria. That was before the Bar Kokhba revolt. Palestina Secunda included the Galilee and the Golan Heights. And Palestina Solitaris included the Negev and part of the Sinai Desert. And that's from the Byzantine era, around about the 4th century. So from the 2nd century up until the end of the British Mandate, 1947, the land was called Palestine. If you look on maps, if you go to Sayyidina Umar referred to the army stationed in that part of the world as Jundu Palestine, the army of Palestine. The Mamelukes wrote on their maps, Ard Palestine, the land of Palestine. The Ottomans that came after them, you also find written on the maps, Palestine. Even though they had different designations for provinces and what they called sanjaks and mutasarrifat and different names for the areas and provinces, still the land was written on the map. It was labeled as Palestine. And even the British, even the Zionists used the term Palestine. So Palestine is a geographical place, and the people living in that place, I mean, especially since the advent of so-called nationalism, I mean, we can mark the French Revolution as the real beginning of the nationalists movement. The people living in such a place would be called Palestinians. Let's take a short break and we'll be back thereafter bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah walhamdulillah. والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه وبعد. Once again, Jamaatul Muslimin, respected viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to our program, Palestine, the Holy Land. And we're going to continue from where we left off before the Muharram break. And we were going through the work of Ghassan Kanafani about the revolt of 1936 to 1939. I have chosen to just to extract. We've already spoken about the context. We've spoken about, for example, the fact that the fallahin were being evicted from their land, especially with the advent of the Histarut, the Jewish labor movement, or Zionist labor movement, and the advent of so-called, and I put in inverted commas, Jewish labor, meaning only Jews, Zionist Jews, could work the land of this newly acquired land by the Zionist movement. And therefore, thousands of Palestinian families were evicted from land that they had inhabited for generations and had been working for generations. Actual fact, I was looking at, they categorize the arable land into that which is most arable, and then there's another categorization after that, another categorization after that. But out of the most arable land that was in the possession of the Arabs, I think it was 106,000 dunams. A dunam is a Turkish Ottoman measurement of land. I will, inshallah ta'ala, we can just bring that up in front of us. Exactly what is the size of a dunam is 1,000 meters squared. There we have it. Is 1,000, which basically is equal to about 900 square meters. A measure of land used in parts of the former Turkish Empire, including Palestine, where it is equal to about 900 square meters. So there was about 590,000 farmers that we're talking about in the 1930s, that were working about 106,000. This is not the only arable land that was in the hands of the. Remember, in terms of total land, by 1948, or let's say before the Nakba, before the catastrophe of 1948, the Zionists had only purchased about 6.6% of the land. And that wasn't all arable land. Most of it was arable land. Remember, they were targeting, especially the absentee landlords, those that were in Lebanon and Syria, because of the separation between the French mandate and the British mandate. Those absentee landlords didn't have access to their land that was in Palestine. So for whatever reason, some of them purely for the money, some of them because it wasn't viable for them anymore, for whatever reason, these families, the Syrian and Lebanese families, absentee landlords, notably the Sarsuk family, which we've spoken about on numerable occasions, they sold their land to the likes of Edmund de Rothschilds and the Jewish National Fund and other Zionist organizations that were buying up land. And as I say, they were going for the best land. So by the 1930s, they had about 102,000 dunams. The Arabs, I'm talking about the most arable land. Of the most arable land, the Arabs had about 106,000, of which 590,000 fallahin, so-called peasant farmers, were working that land. On the 102,000 that was in the hands of the Zionists, only 50,000 were working that land. So you could see that the percentage of Palestinian farmers that relied, they already lost 102,000 dunams. And Palestinians that were working on those farms were now evicted from those farms. And most of them had ended up impoverished, living in the cities. And this is one of the main reasons that Kanafani cites in his book on the revolt of 1936, was one of the main reasons that led up to the actual revolt itself. And then, of course, the other one was the workers in the cities, in the factories. Remember, this was the time of the Great Depression. And one of the very few places in the world where money was being pumped into, where investments were being made, was in Palestine. At the hands of who? At the hands of the Zionists. The Zionists were sending money to Zionist settlers in Palestine, and they were setting up, they were advancing their agricultural projects after having taken over this very arable land, evicting Palestinian farmers off that land. And then even those Palestinian farmers that are now in the cities couldn't even get jobs in factories because, again, industry was dominated by the Zionist industrialists. Agriculture was being dominated by the Zionist farmers, settlers, and industry was now being dominated by the Zionist industrialists. So the farmers were being evicted off their lands. Workers were losing their jobs and being replaced by Zionist workers. And so there was a basic crippling of the Palestinian economy in Palestine. Now, I mean, you can imagine being indigenous to a place, and all of a sudden there's this mass immigration from foreigners, total foreigners. I mean, we look to Europe today, you know, all those people on the right that are anti-immigration, yet they are pro-Israel. That is such a contradiction. Because if you are pro-Israel, you must be pro-immigration. Because there would be no modern Zionist state of Israel if it wasn't for immigration. I mean, that was the problem right from the beginning. Right from the 1920s. That caused the first riots. The riots in Jaffa and the riots at the Wailing Wall, what we call Hayat al-Buraq, the Wall of the Buraq. And the other riots that took place in Safad and Habrun. And it was all because, and we looked at all those commissions, the Palin Commission and the Haycroft Commission and the Woodhead Commission. We looked at all those commissions, those investigations into why were the Palestinians rioting. This is now before the revolt. The revolt is now where basically the pot boils over. The pressure cooker explodes. But I mean, from 1917 to 1936, I mean, that's almost 20 years. 20 years of being patient. Of just making a little noise here and a little riot there. And yes, lives were lost on both sides. I'm not diminishing that or trivializing it for that matter. As we believe that's in our Quran. ومن أجل ذلك كتبنا على بني إسرائيل على أنه من قتل نفسا بغير نفس أو فساد في الأرض فكأنما قتل الناس جميعا ومن أحياها فكأنما أحيا الناس جميعا. And because of the first murder, when Qabil killed Habil, when Cain killed Abel, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran that we wrote for the Israelites, for Bani Israel, that whoever takes a life, من قتل نفسا بغير نفس, without it being for a life, life for a life, eye for an eye, you know, life for a life, what we call ولكم في الحياة ولكم في القصاص حياة. Indeed, in qisas, meaning a life for a life, there is life. And when a person witnesses a murderer being executed, fear is placed into their hearts, never even to think about touching or harming a hair on another person's body, let alone taking their lives. وَلَعِيَذُ بِاللَّهِ. You know? That is the purpose of hudud. Hudud punishments in Islam are there as deterrents to deter people from harming society, whether it be murder, theft, rape, highway robbery. I mean, there are severe punishments for these crimes in order to deter people, to instill fear into their hearts, to stay away from those crimes, that they might be safe from the punishments thereof. So, because of the first murder, when Cain killed Abel, God Almighty, the God of Abraham, Allah Ta'ala, He says, we wrote for Bani Israel, for the Israelites, that whoever takes a life, not being for a life, in other words, and of course, that would have to be done through a court of law, in front of a qadi, in front of a judge. I witnessed that in Saudi Arabia. The court actually presided over this case for a whole year, trying to get the family to accept the compensation for the loss of their breadwinner who was murdered. And the family refused and said they want qisas, a life for a life. And what happened was, eventually the court ruled that the individual who had committed the murder, premeditated, cold-blooded murder, that he should be executed. And in fact, that particular year, there had been 12 murders in the whole of Saudi Arabia. I think that same year, when I came back to South Africa, there had been 27,000 murders in South Africa, where there's no death penalty. And that has to go, through, as I say, through a court of law. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ إِنُّ كَانَ مَنْصُورًا. Do not exceed the boundaries in killing. In other words, don't take the law into your own hands. Indeed, the victim and the family of the victim, kana mansura, is helped by what? By the law. By the law. So whoever takes a life without it being for a life, in other words, through a court of law, أنه من قتل نفسا بغير نفس أو فساد في الأرض, who takes a life causing mischief in the earth. You know, especially in the Arabian Peninsula in the days of ignorance. I mean, you had Harb al-Basus. Harb al-Basus. Harb al-Basus was a war between Bani Bakr and Bani Taghlib that ensued for 40 years. Zir Salim, the brother of Kilab, who had been killed by Jassas. Jassas killed Kilab. Jassas was from Bani Bakr. Kilab was from Bani Taghlib. And so Zir Salim took an oath that he was going to wipe out Bani Bakr. And Bani Taghlib fought Bani Bakr for 40 years. And, I mean, for one life, killing so many, I don't know, hundreds, more than 1,000, Allahu A'lam, I don't know. I don't have the figure. So, when our beloved Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was sent, and he received the final revelation of the Holy Quran, which we believe is the completion, culmination, and perfection of the law and the way, which was first given to Noah, upgraded with Abraham, upgraded with Moses, tweaked with Jesus, you know, وَأُحِلُّ لَكُمْ بَعْضَ الَّذِي حُرِّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ, and I come to make lawful for you some of the things that were prohibited for you, Jesus said to the Israelites. That law and that way was completed, culminated, and perfected with the revelation of the Holy Quran via Gabriel to our beloved Prophet Muhammad Khair al-Anam salawatu rabbi salamuhu alayhi. And so when our beloved Prophet came, no more, you know, and in fact, this is something that, you know, was even prevalent up into the 20th century. When I was living in Yemen, you would have instances where if one member of one tribe was killed, then out of revenge, which Islam prohibits, you cannot take revenge on another tribe by going and looking for the most loved or the most successful or the wealthiest or the one who basically has the highest status in the tribe out of revenge for the killing of... No. The person who committed the murder must be found, taken to a court of law, and if found guilty and the compensation doesn't want to be accepted, then it's a life for a life. And this is what is meant by fasad, corruption, causing corruption in the earth. So whoever takes a life without it being for a life, causing corruption in the earth, then it's as if they've killed the whole of mankind. وَمَنْ أَحْيَاهَا فَكَأَنَّمَا أَحْيَا النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا. And whoever saves one life, it is as if they have saved the whole of mankind. Now, we don't have to look far. And that's why it's so paradoxical. You know, when we think about Jews as a people who follow a particular religion called Judaism. Remember, the identity, Jewish identity, has been corrupted. It's been corrupted by the likes of Moses Hess with his Roman Jerusalem, with the likes of Nachman Sirkin. Nachman Sirkin, who said that the new Zionist Judaism stands in complete contrast to the Judaism of exile. So they were creating a new Jew, a Jew based on race and ethnicity, not on religion. Whereas Orthodox rabbinical Jews say we are Jewish by virtue of the Torah. That's what the Orthodox rabbinical Jews say, the inheritors of the religion from the Pharisees, what remained of the Pharisees. That is where Orthodox rabbinical Judaism comes from. So when the Great Diaspora began in 134, when Hadrian deported the Jews from Judea, some still remained in Galilee, but those that were living in Judea were deported from Judea to the Rhine. That's where the Ashkenazim name comes from Ashkenaz, along the Rhine. Worms, Speyer, and I'm trying to think of the other name, Worms and Mainz. Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. Those are the three cities to where the Jews were deported in Germany. And then, of course, the Sephardim was deported to Sepharda, the Hebrew word for Spain. So the Judaism, the identity as Jews, being followers of Judaism, that identity that they went into exile with, Nachman Sirkin, the father of socialist Zionism, says that the new Zionist Judaism stands in complete contrast to the Judaism exile. Why? Because God isn't even in the equation. These people were atheists. The likes of Theodor Herzl, Nachman Sirkin, even Asher Ginsburg, the cultural Zionist, was deemed to be agnostic. And David Ben-Gurion said, although I quote the Torah a lot, I do not believe in the God that it postulates. Ze'ev Jabotinsky, whose ideology is being implemented by Likud, by Benjamin Netanyahu, the war criminal, as I'm sitting here, as I'm speaking. You know, the inheritors of the ideology of Menachem Begin and Ariel Sharon, who started Likud, by the way, in 1973. And the likes of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who inherited the ideology of people like Rabbi Meir Kahana, who wrote his book in 1981, They Must Go, meaning the Arabs. The Arabs must go, the Palestinians must go from Palestine. That was what he wrote in. And that's why they are doing what they are doing. That's why they are doing what they are doing. So, according to Nachman Sirkin, he said that religious, he said, what did he say? He said the new Zionist Judaism stands in complete contrast to the Judaism of exile. He said that Zionism, this new, what he refers to as the new Judaism, Zionism, he said it uproots religious Judaism, the Judaism of the Torah, by virtue of which the Orthodox rabbinical Jews say they are Jews. That he says it uproots. Zionism uproots religious Judaism in a stronger way than Reform, the Chaslaka movement of Moses Mendelssohn in the 1700s, and assimilation, which is, the likes of the Rothschilds family, were just trying to fit in. The Rothschilds, they wanted to fit in. And actually, like many assimilationists, people like I'm just trying to think of his name now, who was opposed to the Balfour Declaration. He was in fact the secretary of the British administration in India. Montgomery. Inshallah, his name will come back to me. But many of these assimilationists, they were anti-Zionist. The Rothschilds eventually embraced Zionism wholeheartedly and became the most ardent. I mean, people like Edmund de Rothschilds. He spent more than $50 million on establishing a number of Zionist agricultural settlements in the first so-called Aliyah from 1882 to 1904. And then after that as well. Gave millions, worth billions today. And then, of course, Lionel Walter, who was the head of the so-called Jewish Zionist community at the time of the Balfour Declaration, to whom Balfour, when he signed that letter, by the way, the Balfour Declaration was drawn up by the Zionists themselves, but Balfour signed it, and it was addressed to who? It was addressed to Lionel Walter Rothschild. So the Rothschilds were assimilationists, but eventually they became ardent Zionists. But many assimilationists were anti-Zionist because they feared that if a Zionist state, a so-called Jewish state, a Jewish homeland, or national home for the Jews was set up in Palestine, that they would then lose their status as equal citizens of the countries in which they lived. And especially, being in the upper echelons, or at the top of the food chain, as they would say. Now, the Rothschilds, after 1815, after the Battle of Waterloo, the Rothschilds were the richest, literally the richest family in the world, the strongest, even outstripping Barings Bank. I think the German bank, Barings, outstripping them and all other banking families in the world. The Rothschilds, after 1815, when Nathan Mayer Rothschilds made those millions in pounds sterling off the results of the Battle of Waterloo, when the Allies defeated Napoleon. I think I've mentioned the story before, that he had a messenger system with pigeons, and he was getting information off the battlefield that the British were winning. But the rumor spread to England that the British were losing, that Napoleon was winning. And so people used to buy war bonds to support the war. So people started selling their war bonds. And then he also, encouraged the selling, told all of his agents to sell their bonds. But he also had agents at the back door buying up all these bonds that were being sold. And they say he made anything between 1 and 10 million pounds sterling. And we're talking 1815. Again, worth hundreds, if not, hundreds of millions, if not billions today. They became the wealthiest banking family in the world. And they had, if you look at Mayer Amschel, who was the father from Frankfurt, the Judenstraße, living in the Jews' street, in the Jewish ghetto, which they literally, the Germans used to lock up at night. And Mayer Amschel had five sons. Amschel Mayer, Karl Mayer, Solomon Mayer, James Mayer, and Nathan Mayer. Those are the five sons. Amschel Mayer, he was in charge of the German branch of the bank in Frankfurt. Then you had Solomon Mayer, who was in charge of the Austrian branch in Vienna. Then you had Karl Mayer, who was in charge of the Italian branch of the Rothschilds Bank in Naples. And then you had James Mayer, who was in charge of the French branch of the bank in Paris. And then you had Nathan Mayer, who was in charge of the English branch of the bank that was based in London. And initially they were strong assimilationists, because the whole idea of Zionism, we're talking between 1815 and the first, Nathan Birnbaum, he only invented the term Zionism in the 1880s. I think it was around about 1886 or 1890, round about then. So before the advent of political Zionism in the Jewish community, you had this period where there were so many Jews living in Europe trying to assimilate and be considered as equal citizens along with the other citizens of the country, whether they were Christian or whatever religion they might be, but they were considered to be, if those living in Britain were considered to be British, those living in France were considered to be French, those living in Italy considered to be Italians, and they just wanted to be of the citizenship of the country in which they were were living. Now, just to end off our program for today, let's go back to the quote of Nachman Sirkin. What did he say? He said that Zionism uproots religious Judaism in a stronger way than reform and assimilation. Because with reform was a modernization of Judaism, and assimilation, they just wanted to blend in with society, not even be identified as so-called Jews of the Torah or religious Jews. And this is something very important to understand, especially when it comes to us staying away from the conflation of Judaism with Zionism. Let's stop at that point. Inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. I leave you all in the protection of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.